This is an abridged version of 3 presentations that cover learning intentions, success criteria, and descriptive feedback. It's intended as an introduction to the ideas or as a refresher. Some of the slides have information that I won't directly address, but you should pause the video and read them at your own pace if you feel that you need to. You should also note that there are variations on how learning intention and success criteria are worded. Generally, the idea remains the same, so you should use the wording appropriate to your school. So, learning intentions. Our learning intentions for this are to be able to compose effective learning intentions, and our success criteria are to differentiate between learning activities and learning intentions. And the other one we're focusing on is clearly explain what I will teach and why I'm teaching it in the form of learning intentions. The other ones that I haven't mentioned are relevant to the longer presentations. So, why have learning intentions? Pretty much, if you don't know where you're taking your student, then why should they follow? If you don't know why you're teaching something, then why should any student care what you have to say? And if you can't explain where you're going or why you're going there, then how can a student be confident that you even know that? Basically, learning intentions communicate that what you will teach is important and that you know what you're doing, and you're also giving them a clear indication of where you are going so they know what to expect. So, to use an analogy, imagine this. You get up one morning, pack your bags, put the kids in the car. The kids ask, "What are we doing?" You answer, "I'm going to drive. You're going to sing songs, play Spotto, the number plate game, and sleeping tigers." How do you think they're going to respond? No sane adult would subject themselves to that. So let's look at a different version of the same scenario with a focus on why we're doing it. So you tell your kids, "We're going to visit the world's largest monolith. It's a place called Uluru. It has great spiritual significance for the Indigenous Australians, and others travel from all around the world to see it because of its breathtaking beauty. It even changes colour." Chances are you'll get a very different response. Your kids may actually intrigued and ask questions such as what is a monolith, who are the Indigenous Australians, so on and so forth. So you've already engaged them. To which you then reply, "It's a very long trip. We can find out the answers together on the way, and probably a whole bunch of other stuff too." And in doing so, hopefully, it will no longer be a long and tedious trip. We're going to continue to use this analogy of the journey. So, I'm going to say that a learning intention is a destination, and what's most important is that it's a meaningful destination, somewhere that's worth going. Now we need to differentiate that or distinguish that from a learning activity. So the learning activity is the vehicle, and as with all vehicles, there are multiple ways of getting to a place. So there are multiple ways of achieving the same learning intention. They have many shapes and sizes, but some are more effective than others. So, is it a learning intention or a learning activity? Basically, the learning activity is what you are doing, and the learning intention is the authentic reason for why you are doing it. And that's not just because it's in the syllabus. You have to believe in it. If you can't explain why it's important, then how can you expect a student to see any value in it? So, some examples and non-examples. You might want to pause here and read them in a little closer. But what I want you to notice is that all of the learning intentions are transferable. They're things that students can use again and again in a range of situations. It's not specific to the learning activity. Alright, so if you're having trouble checking your learning intentions, here's a variety of questions that you really should ask yourself that help you to think about that. Again, pause if you want to read them more closely. So I'm going to provide some non-example and explain how it can be turned into an example. So the non-example is to identify techniques used in the film Star Wars. The problem with that is that it's very specific to the particular task. There is value in identifying techniques, but we want to make sure that that's a transferable skill. So we've changed that to know the terminology appropriate to the discussion of film, or to be able to identify and explain how specific elements of the film contribute to viewer engagement, or to understand how composers are able to adapt elements of film for different purposes. Okay, here is another example. Again, pause if you want to read it. So, success criteria. When matched to the appropriate learning intention, success criteria enable students to take control of their own learning. So, for this abridged version, our learning intention is to be able to compose effective success criteria. And our success criteria are to be able to that you will be able to differentiate between learning activities and success criteria, and provide clear and accessible indicators of student success. So pretty much success criteria help us to determine if we are on the right track, and are often, so in that sense, they're landmarks. And like all landmarks, they're often worthwhile destinations in and of themselves. Just as on a long trip, you're likely to stop at a number of places and have a look at those landmarks. They answer the questions, are we there yet? And how do you know that you're at the right place? So to give an example, going back to Uluru. Now, if you drove for days on end expecting to see Uluru and arrived at a model of Uluru, you'd be sorely disappointed. So the point is that success criteria need to have sufficient information about the destination or the landmarks to ensure that those are recognisable. And if it's not clear or not sufficiently unpacked, the success criteria can end up being misleading or give a false sense of achievement that will later lead to disappointment. Right, so success criteria answer the questions, are we there yet? How do you know? They are the landmarks along the way. More importantly, and they help students to recognise their level of achievement, so where they're at, so that they can move forward. Again, pause this so you can read through those in more detail. Okay, some examples. Note the importance of the verb in actually explaining what the success criteria is, what they're able to do. And again, these you need to avoid writing the learning activity. So such either that or the product of the learning activity, or simply a list of tasks to complete. That's not success criteria. So some examples and non-examples. What's important is that they understand what they're trying to achieve. Not necessarily for this particular task, but what they're trying to achieve in terms of the steps that are leading them or moving them closer to achieving the learning intention. So, for example, simply saying that your success criteria is to be able to use a simile isn't necessarily an indication of success. A better success criteria might be something more along the lines of, I can incorporate an appropriate simile to develop evocative imagery. Again, some questions to ask yourself if you're struggling with your success criteria. Now, the third part, descriptive feedback. It's probably the most important thing about this is that it's very specific, and it needs to be linked directly to the learning intention and success criteria. So our learning intention here is to understand the relationship between learning intention, success criteria, and descriptive feedback, and to be able to then provide immediate high impact feedback to students. Our success criteria is to provide that feedback that is directly related to the learning intentions, identify relevant strengths and weaknesses in students' work, and provide advice that helps students take the next step in their learning. So imagine this situation. You've got the teacher at the front of the class. They say, you'll be marked on this, so try your hardest and do your best. And then they just simply ask you to draw a house. After that, they then give you that list of criteria that's listed under let's mark each other. And however, you weren't given this in advance, so the correct answers then seem arbitrary, and there is no sense of having assessed anything other than whether or not you can read the teacher's mind. So a better version would be, and looking at this one is actually an art example, would be to be able to apply the conventions of realism to create a recognisable representation of man-made structures. Success criteria accurately represent a contemporary domestic dwelling. Apply the conventions, so on and so forth. Now then you have the activity, but then of course you have the success criteria. And to make them most effective, you need to unpack those success criteria by explaining terminology and providing more detail relevant to the specific task. This also acts as an element of differentiation, where we give students access to more sophisticated vocabulary by unpacking it for them. So, most importantly, descriptive feedback describes where the student is at without judgment or evaluation and provides recommendations for moving forward. So if the learning intention is the destination, the success criteria are the landmarks, and the activity is the vehicle, descriptive feedback is more like information that helps the student to locate themselves on their journey. However, it's not simply a map. It should answer where am I and what direction from here. In that sense, it's more like GPS, in that the directions are tailored to the current location and provide the next steps that they need to be able to address the to achieve the learning intention, and they also need to be something that they can address immediately. It needs to be specific to the student's current level of learning and the context. So a little bit more like what you see here. Note that the examples describe what the student has achieved and what they need to do to continue to the next stage in their journey. Notice also that they do not make a judgment, nor are they summative. There is no mark or grade. So if you want to read a little bit more about this stuff, have a look at the reference list that I've provided here, or have a look at the longer version of this same presentation.